Welcome to Nole Edge, the official podcast of the College of Arts and Sciences at Florida State University. I'm your host, Amy Walden, the Assistant Director for Visual and Social Media with the College of Arts and Sciences, and today we welcome Antje Muntendam, an Associate Professor with the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. Antje is also a coordinator and advisor of linguistics and an affiliate faculty member with FSU's Native American and Indigenous Studies Center. Antje, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
On today's episode, we're talking about linguistics and code switching, taking a deeper dive into the science behind language and the research being conducted right here at FSU to better understand this science. Before we get started, a quick note for our listeners that every November is International Education Month here at FSU. So all month long, we've been celebrating the benefits of international education and exchange. You can join in on the conversation on social media all year long with the hashtag FSU Global. So Antje, can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, and how you got involved in your area of study?
Yeah, so I'm from the Netherlands. So I did a bachelor and master's in Hispanic linguistics at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And then I got a PhD from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, so here in the United States. And during my master's, I lived abroad. I lived in Peru and Bolivia. And so I studied in Lima at the university. And then I did field work on Spanish and Quechua, which is an indigenous language, in Bolivia. And ever since then, I just kept working on bilingualism and language contact.
Excellent. You played a pivotal role in the development and launch of FSU's Linguistics Program offered through the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. Can you tell us why this program is so important and what students can learn?
Yeah, of course. So many students do not know what linguistics is until they take their first linguistics class. So linguistics is the scientific study of language. So we study sounds, words, sentences, meaning. We're also interested in how children acquire language, how languages vary, the relationship between social factors and language, and also language in the brain. So basically, all this research tells us a little bit about our tacit knowledge of language and also how our brain works. And then there are also many practical applications of linguistics. So we prepare students for careers in different sectors. So linguists work in, for instance, teaching or translation and interpretation, data analysis, development of voice recognition software, also in foreign service, U.S. intelligence, curriculum development. So a lot of different sectors. And then we also prepare students for advanced studies in either linguistics or related areas. So for example, cognitive science or education or speech, language, and hearing science. So we're a very interdisciplinary program. We take information from different fields. So we combine a lot of insights from psychology, anthropology, computer science, education, and then offer a range of courses in all these areas, so psycholinguistics, social linguistics, second language acquisition, computational linguistics. So students learn a lot of different skills. So in a lot of our classes, we do a lot of data analysis, and students solve linguistic problems. So this helps them with their analytical skills. We also pay a lot of attention to language variation, social factors that affect language variation. So that helps them with critical thinking skills. We also read a lot of empirical articles, and students present empirical articles. So they learn about statistics, designing experiments, and depending on the electives that they take, they might also learn computational tools, programming skills. So for instance, they learn how to deal with large amount of data, how extract large amount of data, and analyze and annotate them. And that helps them for certain jobs like at Google or Amazon that are very much in demand right now.
Yeah, I was fascinated to learn about how interdisciplinary the program is and all the career paths that you can take with this type of degree. Let's start off with the basics for this podcast topic. For anyone unfamiliar with this area of study, what exactly is code switching?
Yeah, so code switching is the alternating use of two languages or more than two languages within a conversation or even within the same sentence. So bilinguals can say one sentence in one language and then another sentence in the other language. And so that is called intersentential code switching. But you can also mix within the same sentence, and that's called intrasentential code switching. And that part is particularly interesting because it tells us how bilinguals deal with like multiple languages, so how they deal basically with multiple grammars. And yes, and you can basically look at code switching from different perspectives. So there are structural approaches that look at like when people code switch. So code switching is not random, and bilinguals switch at a certain point in a sentence, but not at any point. And so structural approaches deal with that, like when is it acceptable to switch and when it's not acceptable. And with acceptable, I mean like acceptable to the speakers, not from a prescriptive point. Then psycholinguistic approaches look more at like what happens in the brain when bilinguals produce a code switch or perceive a code switch. So for example, they look at switching costs. So there's a delay in processing when you switch. And then social linguistic approaches look more at why do people code switch? What are the differences between individuals, but also between communities? Why do they code switch in certain communities and not in other communities?
It's fascinating to learn about. I'm so intrigued by this topic. What do we know about why code switching occurs, and what are researchers like yourself still trying to understand about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so bilinguals code switch often as an expression of their bilingual identity. So in some cases, code switching is the unmarked choice, so people constantly go back between the two languages. But in other cases, a code switch is either to highlight something or to put emphasis on something. And it can be different reasons to code switch. But so we know that in order to be able to code switch, you have to be highly proficient in both languages. So a lot of people who are not familiar with code switching think that bilinguals don't speak one of the two languages, and that's why they mix them. But you actually have to be really proficient in the two languages to be able to mix them. And so we also know that code switching is not random. So there are certain points where you can switch, certain points where bilinguals do not switch, or where it sounds strange. But so most of the research that we have is based on isolated examples from the literature. And it's hard to compare. So they construct different models. So there are different models that propose when you can code switch and when you cannot code switch. But because these are based on different communities, different examples, it's hard to compare them. So one of the things that we do in our lab is that we try to test the models and compare them. So for instance, in our lab, we did a study on switching between a subject and a verb, so a subject pronoun and a verb. And so there are some models that say like, well, you cannot never switch between a subject pronoun and a verb. That should be not acceptable. And then there are other models that say, well, you can switch in certain contexts. And so we basically did an experimental study looking at that and then found evidence for one of the two models. So that's one of the newer things that we've been doing. We also do some eye tracking studies on code switching. So eye tracking is a technique where you measure eye movements. So we basically measure eye movements while participants read a sentence or they listen to a sentence. And the idea is that the eye movements reflect cognitive processing. So basically, if you spend a lot of time on one particular word while you're reading a sentence, that reflects that there's some difficulty with processing that word, or when your eyes move back or something like that. So we use those kind of techniques to look at processing during code switching. And so it's very implicit. So you don't have to deal with like it being a stigmatized variety or attitudes towards code switching. Some other newer things that we're looking at is, for instance, a lot of the code switching so far, the research has focused on two languages, but there are a lot of communities where there are three languages, or where people speak even more than three languages, right? And so now starting more like looking at, well, what happens with trilingual code switching, or when there are four languages involved. And then also differences between communities. So when you look at Spanish-English bilinguals, for instance, in some communities, people code switch a lot, but the code switching in Miami might not be the same as code switching in, let's say, Chicago or Los Angeles, because the social linguistic situations are different. So we're also looking into that. And then more recently, I've looked at the prosody of code switching. So prosody refers to like melody of a sentence or the rhythm. So it includes intonation. And so that's interesting when you look at languages that differ in terms of their prosody. So if you look at Chinese, that has tones, for example, and English, or Papiamento, which is a Creole language, and also has tones, and Spanish or Dutch, it's interesting to see what happens with prosody and to what extent does prosody constrain code switching. So yeah, in all, there's like a lot that we can still do.
Especially with how many languages there are
Right.
and
Yes.
all the endless possibilities. Oh my goodness. So you also study bilingualism in your work, including Spanish and English bilingualism in the United States, among many other language pairs. What has been the most surprising or interesting finding you've learned about bilingualism through your research?
Yeah. So yeah, I've studied a lot of different languages. So I've worked with Spanish and English, as you said, but also with Quechua and Spanish in South America. I've worked with Turkish and Dutch in the Netherlands. And then with students also with Arabic and Spanish and some other language combinations. And so one of the things that I find interesting is how linguistic and social factors interact in bilingualism. So for example, it's interesting to see what gets transferred from one language to another language. So when we look at heritage speakers who speak like one language at home and then the other language in society. So one language is like the weaker language. They don't speak it that much anymore, but it's their first language, right? And then the other language is their more dominant language. They use it more often, but they learned it sometimes a little bit later. And so what we see in terms of like what gets transferred from one language to another, we see that from the dominant language, so for example, English to, English might not be the best case, but Spanish to Quechua, for example, you get a lot of transfer of like lexical material, so a lot of words, morphemes, so parts of words, some sounds. But then if you look in the other direction from Quechua to Spanish, for example, and this also happens with other languages, you see that the weaker language mostly transfers like the meaning. So not the actual words or the actual syntax or structures, but it's like more the meaning that gets transferred. So to give an example, if you look at Quechua Spanish bilinguals, in Quechua you have something called evidentiality, which indicates the source of information. So in Quechua, in every sentence, you basically have to say where that information is from, whether it's like you directly witnessed it or someone told you, so it's secondhand information, or you just inferred it. And so in Spanish, we don't have that. But so instead of like transferring particular words or morphemes from Quechua to Spanish, people just transfer the meaning. And so they're using existing structures in Spanish, in this case, like past perfect verbs, and they get new meaning. So they suddenly mean like it's surprising that someone came or something. That's something I find interesting. Yeah, in addition, just to see how the weaker language still influences the dominant language. And sometimes that's very subtle, so you don't immediately notice it. But so, for example, in a study with Turkish and Dutch, we did an experiment with Turkish-Dutch bilinguals, and they read sentences in Dutch. And we noticed that they still used the way that information is structured in Turkish when they were reading Dutch. And so you wouldn't immediately notice that, but when you do an eye tracking experiment, then you find out these subtle differences, which actually might have bigger implications in education, for example, right? Or children reading.
That's fascinating. And going back to the eye tracking once again, I'm just blown away by that technology and how much that can tell you about linguistics. What would you say to a student who is interested in the study of linguistics?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say linguistics is present in all aspects of life, even when you don't really think about it. So for example, linguistics is involved in the creation of like series or movies. When you think about like dialect coaches who help characters with their speech, right? Or when you think about sci-fi movies, a lot of the sci-fi movies have like a constructed language. And so that is all includes linguistics, right? So linguistics includes like creating these languages. Then series like CSI, for example, have forensic linguists, right? And then there are also many technical applications, as I said before. So, for example, in artificial intelligence, which is getting bigger and bigger, right? But also applications like Alexa or improving search engines such as Google search engines, right? Smartphone that autocorrects your speech, right? But then also things like if we discuss what does it mean to be woke, for example, that also involves like linguistics, right? And in general, linguistics is really, it's an expression of your identity, right? So in that sense, it's really involved in everything. And you cannot really ignore it. To students who are interested in linguistics, I would say that they should talk to me or one of my colleagues and maybe take one of the introductory courses in linguistics to see if they like it. So for example, we have a course, Introduction to Linguistics, but then we also have a lower level course, World Languages, where we talk about all the languages in the world and how they're different and how they're similar, and then also the relationship between language and culture. And then also they should come to activities that our Lingo, our linguistic student organization, organizes it.
Great. So we end every podcast with our bowl of mystery questions. So Antje, please draw a question and answer.
Okay, so the question is, what do you love most about Tallahassee? I love the nature. I love all the parks. One of my favorite parks is Piney Z or the Phipps Park, just all the nature around. We don't have that in the Netherlands. So.
Yeah, there's really not a bad park in Tallahassee.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I agree with you. Well, Antje, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. And if you would like to learn more about Antje Muntendam and her research at the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics, visit modlang.fsu.edu. For more information about International Education Month, visit global.fsu.edu. Thanks for tuning into Nole Edge, and we'll catch you next time.